Um, Easements implied from existing use, also known as a quasi-easement. An easement may be implied if, prior to the time the tract is divided, a use exists on the servient part that is reasonably necessary for the enjoyment of the dominant part, and a court determines that the parties intend the use to continue after division of the property. It is sometimes called a quasi-easement before the tract is divided because an owner cannot hold an easement on his own land. A. Existing use at time tract divided. For a use to give rise to an easement, it must be apparent and continuous at the time the tract is divided. Apparent means that a grantee could discover the existence of the use upon reasonable inspection. A non-visible use may still be apparent if surface connections or the like would put a reasonable person on notice of its existence. B. Reasonable necessity. Whether a use is reasonably necessary to the enjoyment of the dominant parcel depends on many factors, including the cost and difficulty of the alternatives and whether the price paid reflects the expected continued use of the servient portion of the tract. And last, C. Grant or reservation. An easement implied in favor of the grantee is said to be created by implied grant, while an easement implied in favor of the grantor is said to be created by implied reservation. 2. Easements implied without any existing use. In two limited situations, easements are implied in a conveyance, even though there is no pre-existing use. That's A, a subdivision plat, and B, profit a prender. Subdivision plat. When lots are sold in a subdivision with reference to a recorded plat or map that also shows streets leading to the lots, buyers of the lots have implied easements to use the streets in order to gain access to their lots. These easements continue to exist even if the public easements held by the city or county in the streets are later vacated. B. Profit a prender. When a landowner grants a profit a prender to a person to remove a valuable product of the soil, example grass, asphalt, or the holder of the profit also has an implied easement to pass over the surface of the land and to use it as reasonably necessary to extract the product. Okay, so the third easement by implication, created by implication, is an easement by necessity. When the owner of a tract of land sells a part of the tract and by this division deprives one lot of public access to a road or utility line, a right-of-way by absolute necessity is created by implied grant or reservation over the lot with access to the public road or utility line. The owner of the servient parcel has the right to locate the easement, provided the location is reasonably convenient. An easement by necessity terminates when the easement ceases. Prescription is another form of, or another method of creating an easement. Acquiring an easement by prescription is analogous to acquiring property by adverse possession, which we explained. Those elements that are the same are open and notorious, adverse, continuous use, and when prescriptive easements cannot be acquired. So for open and notorious, the user must not attempt to conceal his use. Underground or other non-visible uses such as pipes and electric lines are considered open and notorious if the use could be discovered, example through surface connections upon inspection. Adverse. The use must not be within the owner's permission. Unlike adverse possession, the use need not be exclusive. The user of a common driveway, for example, may acquire a prescriptive easement even though the owner uses it too. Continuous use. Continuous adverse use does not mean constant use. A continuous claim of right with periodic acts that put the owner on notice of the claimed easement fulfills the requirement. Note that tacking is permitted for prescriptive easements just as for adverse possession. And fourth, when prescriptive easements cannot be acquired. Negative easements cannot arise by prescription, nor generally may easements in public lands. An easement cannot An easement by necessity cannot give rise to an easement by prescription. However, if the necessity ends, so does easement, and the use is adverse from that point forward. Scope. Courts enforcing easements are often called upon to interpret the arrangement in order to determine the scope and intended beneficiaries of the interest. The key to interpretation employed in all these cases is the reasonable intent of the original parties. What would the parties reasonably have provided had they contemplated the situation now before the court? What result would reasonably serve the purposes of the arrangement? General rules of construction. If, as typically happens, the language used in general, example, right-of-way over Blackacre, the following rules of construction usually apply. Ruminant 1. Ambiguities are resolved in favor of the grantee unless the conveyance is gratuitous. And Ruminant 2. Subsequent conduct of the parties respecting the arrangement is relevant. Ruminant 3. The parties are assumed to have intended a scope that would reasonably serve the purposes of the grant, and to have foreseen reasonable changes in the use of the dominant estate. The rule of reasonableness will be applied only to the extent that the governing language is general. If the location or scope of the permitted use is spelled out in detail, the specifics will govern, and reasonable interpretation will be excluded. There's two examples. 1. In 1890, the owner of Blackacre granted to B, the owner of Whiteacre, a right-of-way over Blackacre for purposes of ingress and egress to Whiteacre from the public highway running along the western boundary of Blackacre. At the time of the grant, there were only horses and buggies, not automobiles. Applying a rule of reasonableness to the general language creating a right-of-way, a court would probably find that the right-of-way could today be used for the cars. If, however, the use of cars would impose a substantially greater burden on Blackacre, then court would probably find against the use on grounds that it was outside the scope reasonably contemplated by A and B. Now, example 2. If in the example just given the right-of-way was specifically dedicated only to the use of horses and carriages, automobile use would be excluded. Similarly, if the right-of-way was specifically located over the southern 10 feet of Blackacre, the rule of reasonableness could not be invoked to change or enlarge the location. B. Absence of location. If an easement is created but not specifically located on the servient tenement, an easement of sufficient width, height, and direction to make the intended use reasonably convenient will be implied. The owner of the servient tenement may select the location of the easement so long as her selection is reasonable. C. Changes in use. In the absence of specific limitations in the deed creating an easement, the courts will assume that the easement is intended by the parties to meet both present and future reasonable needs of the dominant tenement. Example, a roadway easement of unspecified width was created in 1920 when cars were only 6 feet wide. However, today cars are considerably wider because the original roadway easement was not specifically limited in width. The easement will expand in size to accommodate the changing and expanding needs of the owner of the dominant tenement. But a basic change in the nature of the use is not allowed. Thus, a telephone or power line may not be added on the roadway. Many courts are more liberal in allowing such additions if the roadway easement is public rather than private. D. Easements by necessity or implication. In the case of easements by necessity, the extent of the necessity determines the scope of the easement. Because there is no underlying written instrument to interpret, courts will look instead to the circumstances giving rise to the easement. Similarly, with other implied easements, the quasi-easement will provide the starting point for the court's construction of the scope of the easement. Modifications in the easement will be enforced to the extent that they are necessary for reasonably foreseeable changes in the use of the dominant parcel. Use of servient estate. Absent an express restriction in the original agreement, the owner of the servient estate may use her land in any way she wishes so long as her conduct does not interfere with the performance of the easement, profit, covenant, or servitude. For example, A grants to B Water Company the right to lay water pipes in a specified 5-foot right-of-way. A is not by this grant necessarily precluded from granting similar rights in the same right-of-way to a competing company so long as the second grant does not interfere with the use made by B, the original grantee. A may also build over the right-of-way so long as the structure does not unreasonably interfere with B's use. 1. The duty to repair under the use of the servient estate. If the holder of the benefit is the only party making use of the easement, the party has the duty to make repairs, for example, fill in potholes on right-of-way. And absent a special agreement, the servient owner has no duty to do so. If the easement is not exclusive and both the holder and the benefit and the servient owner are making use of the easement, the court will apportion the repair costs between them on the basis of their relative use. F. Intended beneficiaries, subdivision of dominant parcel. When an easement is created for the benefit of the landowner and the landowner later subdivides the parcel, there is a question whether each subdivision grantee will succeed to the original benefit. The answer will turn on whether the extension of the benefit to each of the subdivided parcels will burden the servient estate to a greater extent than was contemplated by the original parties. Absent any other evidence on intent, a court will not find an intent to allow an extension if extending the benefit to each parcel in the subdivision will unreasonably overburden the servient estate. Weighing all the circumstances, a court could find subdivision into 4 lots reasonable, but subdivision into 50 lots unreasonable. It is determined on a case-to-case basis. G. Effect of use outside scope of easement. When the owner of an easement uses it in a way that exceeds its legal scope, the easement is said to be surcharged. The remedy of the servient landowner is an injunction of the excess use and possibly damages if the servient land has been harmed. However, the excess use does not terminate the easement or give the servient landowner a power of termination. Termination of estates. An easement, like any other property interest, may be created to last in perpetuity or for a limited period of time. To the extent the parties to its original creation provide for the natural termination of the interest, such limitations will control. Stated conditions. If the parties to the original creation of an easement set forth specific conditions upon the happening of which the easement right will terminate, the conditions will be recognized. On this basis, the following conditions are valid. An easement granted so long as repairs are maintained, an easement granted so long as X is the holder of the dominant tenement, an easement granted until the dominant tenement is used for commercial purposes, etc. B. Unity of ownership. By definition, an easement is the right to use the lands of another for a special purpose. On this basis, the ownership of the easement and of the servient tenement must be in different persons. If ownership of the two comes together in one person, the easement is extinguished. 1. Complete unity required. For an easement to be extinguished by merger of dominant and servient tenements, the duration of the servient tenement must be equal to or longer than the duration of the dominant tenement, and therefore the easement with which it is combined. For example, 2 pretty long examples here. It has to do with the estate. If we're talking a life estate and the unity of ownership gets a term of years, say for instance 10 years, then that's not really a unity of ownership as far as I am concerned. No revival. If complete unity of title is acquired, the easement is extinguished. Even though there may be later separation, the easement will not be automatically revived. Release. An easement may be terminated by a release given by the owner of the easement interest to the owner of the servient tenement. A release requires the concurrence of both owners and is in effect a conveyance. The release must be executed with all the formalities that are required for the valid creation of the easement. And you have 3 different kinds. The first being easement appurtenant, next naturally easement in gross, and third statute of frauds. The basic characteristic of an easement appurtenant is that it becomes, for the purpose of succession, an incident of possession of the dominant tenement. This basic characteristic requires that the easement interest not be conveyed independently of the conveyance of the dominant tenement. However, an easement appurtenant may be conveyed to the owner of the servient tenement without a conveyance to the same grantee of the dominant tenement. This is an exception to the general alienability characteristics of an easement appurtenant. Easement and gross, under the release section here, the basic characteristic of an easement and gross is that unless it is for a commercial purpose, it is inalienable. However, an easement and gross can be released, for example, can be conveyed to an owner of the servient tenement. This is an exception to the general characteristics of an easement and gross. And the statute of frauds requires that every conveyance of an interest in land that has a duration long enough to bring into play a particular state statute of frauds, typically 1 year, must be evidenced in writing. This writing requirement is also applicable to a release of an easement interest. If the easement interest that is being conveyed has a duration of greater than 1 year, a writing is required in order to satisfy the statute of frauds. An oral release is ineffective, although it may become effective by estoppel. Another way to terminate an easement is by abandonment. Letter D. It has become an established rule that an easement can be extinguished without conveyance where the owner of the privilege demonstrates by physical action an intention to permanently abandon the easement. To work at an abandonment, the owner must have manifested an intention never to make use of the easement again, if it's not in writing. 1. Physical act required. An abandonment of an easement occurs when the easement holder physically manifests an intention to permanently abandon the easement. Such physical action brings about a termination of the easement by operation of law, and therefore no writing is required. For example, the statute of frauds need not be complied with. But again, an abandonment ought to just be documented in writing. Mere words are insufficient, and mere non-use is insufficient. So, the oral expressions of the owner of the easement that he does not intend to use the easement again, for example, he wishes to abandon it, by themselves are insufficient to constitute an abandonment of the easement. For words alone to operate as a termination, such expression will only be effective if it qualifies as a release. For example, a statute of frauds must be complied with. Note, however, that oral expressions may be sufficient if accomplished by a long period of non-use. Mere non-use is insufficient. An easement is not terminated merely because it is not used for a long period by its owner. To terminate the easement, the non-use must be combined with other evidence of intent to abandon it. Non-use itself is not considered sufficient evidence of that intent. Estoppel is another means of terminating a easement. While the assertions of the holder of the easement are insufficient to work a termination, unless there is a valid compliance with the requirements of a release, an easement may be extinguished by virtue of the reasonable reliance and change of position of the owner of the servient tenement based on assertions or conduct of the easement holder. For example, the owner of a right-of-way tells the owner of the servient tenement that the owner of the servient tenement may build a building on the servient tenement in such a way as to make the right-of-way no longer usable, and the servient tenant does in fact build the building. There will be an extinguishment of the easement by estoppel. For an easement to be extinguished by estoppel, 3 requirements must be satisfied. Namely, there must be Romanet 1, some conduct or assertion by the owner of the easement, Romanet 2, a reasonable reliance on the owner of the servient tenement, and Romanet 3, coupled with a change of position. Even though there is an assertion by the easement holder, if the owner of the servient tenement does not change her position based upon the assertion, the easement will not be terminated. Letter F. An easement may be prescription. An easement may be extinguished as well as created by prescription. Long continued possession and enjoyment of the servient tenement in a way that would indicate to the public that no easement right existed will end the easement right. So long continued use works as a statute of limitations precluding the whole world, including the easement holder, from asserting that his privilege exists. The termination of the easement by prescription is fixed by analogy to the creation of the easement by prescription. The owner of the servient tenement must so interfere with the easement as to create a cause of action in favor of the easement holder. The interference must be open, notorious, continuous, and non-permissive for the statutory period, for example, 20 years. Necessity. Letter G. Easements created by necessity expire as soon as the necessity ends. H. Condemnation. Condemnation of the servient estate will extinguish the non-possessory interest. Courts are split, however, on whether the holder of the benefit is entitled to compensation for the value lost. And letter I, destruction of servient estate. If the easement is in a structure, for example a staircase, involuntary destruction of the structure by fire or flood will extinguish the easement. Voluntary destruction, for example tearing down a building to erect a new one, will not, however, terminate the easement. Licenses. Comparing easements to licenses. Licenses, like affirmative easements, privilege their holder to go upon the land of another, the licenser. Unlike an affirmative easement, the license is not an interest in land. It is merely privilege, revocable at the will of the licensor. Although licenses may acquire some of the characteristics of easements through estoppel or by being coupled with an interest, the statute of frauds does not apply to licenses, and licensees are not entitled to compensation if the land is taken by eminent domain. Licenses are quite common. Examples of licenses include delivery persons, plumbers, party guests, etc. Assignability. An essential characteristic of a license is that it is personal to the licensee and therefore not alienable. The holder of a license privilege cannot convey such right. In fact, most courts have held that the license privilege is so closely tied to the individual parties that it is revoked by operation of law upon an attempted transfer by the licensee. Revocation and termination. Another essential characteristic of a license is that it is revocable by nature. It may be revoked at any time by a manifestation of the licensor's intent to end it. This manifestation may be by a formal notice of revocation, or it may consist of conduct that obstructs the licensee's continued use. Similarly, the licensee can surrender the privilege whenever he desires to do so. A license ends by operation of law upon the death of the licensor. In addition, a conveyance of the servient tenement by the licensor terminates the licensee's privilege. Public amusement cases. Tickets issued by theaters, race courses, and other places of amusement have given rise to some controversy. The traditional rule is that such tickets create a license. Once describing a ticket as granting a license, the essential characteristic of a license applies. For example, it is revocable by nature. On this basis, the licensor may terminate the licensee's privilege at will. Breach of contract. A license may be granted pursuant to an express or implied contract between the licensor and licensee. On this basis, the termination of the licensee's privilege may constitute a breach of contract. While many courts may grant a cause of action for money damages for the revocation of a license and breach of contract, they continue to sustain the licensor's right to terminate the licensee's privilege to continue to remain on the servient tenement. Example, A pays a $70 greens fee to play 18 holes of golf on B's property. After A has played his only 9 holes, B terminates A's right to be on B's property. Because A acquired a license and it is revocable by its very nature, B's action is not, in property terms, wrongful. However, A may have a cause of action against B to recoup part or all of A's $70. C. Failure to create an easement. The statute of frauds requires that any conveyance of an interest in land, including an easement interest of duration greater than 1 year, must be memorialized in writing to be enforceable. If a party attempts to create an easement orally, the result is the creation of a license, for example, a revocable privilege. Note, however, that if an oral attempt to create an easement is subsequently executed, to the extent that it would be inequitable to permit its revocation, for example, the licensee has expended substantial funds in reliance on the license, the licensor may be estopped to revoke the license. Irrevocable licenses, the estoppel theory, and license coupled with an interest, which includes A, B, and C, vendee of a chattel, termination of tenancy, and inspection for waste, before moving into profits. So let's finish this irrevocable licenses section. According to the estoppel theory, if a licensee invests substantial amounts of money or labor in reliance on the license, the licensor may be estopped to revoke the license, and the license will thus become an equivalent of an affirmative easement. Example, A orally licenses B to come onto Blackacre to excavate a drainage ditch connected to B's parcel. Whiteacre comma, Whiteacre. B does so at substantial expense. A will probably be stopped to revoke the license and prevent B from using the ditch. Under the majority view, such irrevocable licenses or easements by estoppel last until the owner receives sufficient benefit to reimburse himself for the expenditures made in reliance on the license. A minority of courts treat easements by estoppel like any other affirmative easements and give them a potentially indefinite duration. The second type of irrevocable license to be discussed is a license coupled with an interest. If a license is coupled with an interest, it will be irrevocable as long as the interest lasts. For example, A. Vendee of a chattel. The purchaser of a chattel located upon the seller's land is, in the absence of an express stipulation to the contrary, given the privilege to enter upon the seller's land for the purpose of removing the chattel. The purchaser's right is irrevocable. He must, however, enter at reasonable times and in a reasonable manner. Example, A. The owner of Blackacre sells 100 crates of oranges stored in a shed on Blackacre and at the same time licenses B to come on to Blackacre to remove the crates of oranges. B has an irrevocable license to enter Blackacre and remove the crates within a reasonable time. I was thinking more like having a horse stabled on a property, but whatever. B, termination of tenancy. If a tenant's right to possess land has been lawfully terminated, the tenant may still re-enter the land at reasonable times and in a reasonable manner for the purpose of removing his chattels. This is an irrevocable privilege. And lastly, C, inspection for waste. The owner of a future interest in lands, example, landlord, holder of a reversionary interest or remainder man, is privileged to enter upon the land at reasonable times and in a reasonable manner for the purpose of determining whether waste is being committed by the holder of the present possessory estate.